Hello everyone, welcome to this video. This video is going to serve the purposes of several classes, some of which might include my English 101, might include technical writing, and it can also include my speech course. So depending on what course you have me in, this video is applicable to all of them. But what I'm going to do today is kind of give you a basic foundational way of thinking about rhetoric. And we're going to use this kind of extremely corny acronym called PACT, P-A-C-T, PACT. This isn't something that I came up with on my own while I was working on my doctorate at WVU. This is something that the English department embraced. And I kind of think it's a good idea. I think what this lesson has to offer is applicable to almost any type of writing that you might do or public speaking. So let's get straight to it then and talk about PACT. So anytime you have a piece of writing, maybe a speech, maybe a presentation, this is a nice way to kind of ensure that you're communicating effectively. So, PACT, PACT, purpose, audience, conventions, and trouble spots. So let me kind of walk you through each one and explain the significance of each. So anytime you have a piece of writing or a presentation, you're trying to make sure that you're communicating well, you always kind of have to ask yourself, what's the purpose? What purpose are you trying to accomplish? What's the main goal or purpose in this particular situation? Do I have any secondary purposes? Well, let's take, for instance, in technical writing and speech, there's an assignment called writing instructions. You have to provide instructions on how to do a complicated task and provide those instructions in a simple way. So whether you're writing it in technical writing or presenting it in speech. So your purpose in this case is to inform the reader or the listener about how to do this particular task. Your purpose is, by the time they are finished with your handout or your presentation, they will be able to do the task themselves, right? So each piece of writing you'll ever do, it doesn't matter what course it is, always has some type of purpose. This is also a good way to analyze how effective other pieces of writing are. One thing that I ask technical writing students to do is to constantly evaluate documents. Was this document successful or not? Did it achieve its purpose? Right? So whenever you're evaluating your own documents or someone else's documents, you can use this framework as well. But it always starts with purpose. Did you achieve your purpose? Were you kind of confused about what your purpose was? Right? Sometimes that happens. So keep that in mind. The next one is audience. Audience. Who's your main audience? What are their expectations? Who else might be reading, viewing, or listening to my message? Well, in any type of class, your audience is always your teacher, right? You always have a teacher as your audience. So that's kind of a very formal audience to always think about. But let's say for technical writing, if I'm asking you to do a feasibility analysis or maybe instructions, your audience in technical writing is always the lowest common denominator. So always kind of think to yourself about maybe the dumbest person you know. How would you communicate to the dumbest person that you know? There's really no better way to explain it. That is your audience for that piece of writing, in this case, instructions. Right? You have to you have to be able to reach, someone with a very basic reading comprehension level. Right? You shouldn't have big, gigantic words in your instructions. Right? You have to keep your prose simple and concise. So that's a case of audience. Right? Anytime we're dealing with technical writing, you always have to think about who your audience is. For public speaking, it's the same thing. Um, Sometimes you might have an audience of people who all might have some expertise on a topic, in which case you can design your word choices and your jargon and all of that around that audience. But oftentimes too, you might have an audience of just layman people. Right. So sometimes you have to, it's always a matter of assessing who your audience is. Before you write anything, before you say anything, always ask yourself, who's my audience here? How do I tailor whatever I'm doing to my audience? Does this piece of writing, so maybe you're evaluating another piece of writing, does this other piece of writing effectively know who its audience is? If you felt like maybe, let's say some instructions again, maybe you have a piece of instructions, maybe maybe they're taking for granted that you know something that you don't know, right? In that case, that is a failure in communication to audiences. Sometimes they might, sometimes you might assume that your readers know something, but they don't. So there's another case. Conventions is the next part of this. What delivery method is best suited to the situation? What are the conventions for the medium I've chosen? What other conventions do I need to keep in mind in terms of tone, style, documentation, or grammar? So again, this depends on what type of circumstance you're in. If you're doing something like a personal narrative in English 101, well, the convention would be to use something like the first person point of view, right? Because you're talking about yourself. But let's say you're writing instructions, right? Instructions have very precise conventions. You have to write in an imperative voice, commanding the reader to do something. The convention is you have to write in very simple, concise language. If you're doing an argumentative research paper in English 101, the convention is to have a thesis, to back up your thesis with evidence. So each assignment that you do will have conventions to it. So, and the same thing for public speaking. Right? If you give an informative speech, you give a persuasive speech, a special occasion speech, no matter what you're doing in there, all of those different types of speeches also have conventions. So what are the rules for the assignment that you're doing? See how well you follow the rules. Right? If you're finding that you're not following the rules well, that's a problem that you're running into. And then the last one's trouble spots. So what could get in the way of my goals? How can I anticipate and avoid trouble spots? So when you run into trouble spots, you run into trouble spots with these first three things. So if a piece of writing isn't 100%, isn't as effective as it could be, it's probably because of a failure somewhere in communication of one of these first three letters, PAC. So maybe you don't fully realize what the purpose of the assignment is. Maybe you don't really fully comprehend who your audience is. Maybe the conventions. Maybe you're not quite following the conventions of this particular assignment. All right. Whatever the case is, that's where you assess and analyze. Whenever you're assessing someone else's writing, you can ask yourself. So maybe let's say you're doing peer review in technical writing or peer review in English 101. You Usually you can always ask yourself, what's the conventions of this paper? Is this person following the conventions? Right? Maybe they don't write in the first person in a personal narrative. That's a problem, right? Maybe they don't use the imperative voice in writing instructions. Well, that's a problem. So trouble spots are when anything goes wrong in these first few things. You can always sort of learn, grow, and improve if you can analyze and identify your trouble spots. So this is, like I said, this is a basic framework. And so just a basic way of thinking about things. It's a way of analyzing and assessing writing. I might ask you, depending on what type of class it is, to do a PACT analysis of maybe a document. So if I do ask you to do that, ask yourself, what's the purpose of this? What's this author trying to do? Who's the audience for this piece? And what are the conventions of this type of writing? See if you can figure that out as you read through a piece of writing if I ask you to do a PACT analysis. So that should be it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions about this. Take care, guys. See you next time.